Hey y'all, in this video I'm going to cover the topic of gun violence in a level of detail that most media outlets do not. This video is going to be rather long, and I have to forewarn you that this video is going to deal with data and statistics that are very cold and unfeeling. I want those of you who have been affected by gun violence, suicide, violent crime, motor vehicle fatalities, and murder to know that I do empathize with you. I myself am represented in some of this data that I'm going to present. Very close friends and family are also represented in this data. I too have been impacted by gun violence, suicide, violent crime, motor vehicle fatalities, and murder. In fact, last month, November of 2018, for those of you watching this in the future, a longtime friend of mine, she was very brutally murdered, and that wound is really very still fresh. It's still fresh. I am going to be setting aside my emotions for the duration of the video, and we'll be presenting this cold, unfeeling data so that people can hear the facts about gun violence in the United States and here in Washington, and the Second Amendment. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. The media, activist organizations funded by billionaires, billionaires themselves, and politicians have made some very bold claims about the state of gun violence in the United States and here in Washington state. The first thing we need to understand is how they actually define gun violence. I don't know about you, but when I think of gun violence, I think of people who are actually being murdered with guns. The Brady campaign, however, their definition goes far beyond this. Included in their definition of gun violence are people who are committing suicide with a firearm, suicide attempts, unintentional shootings that may or may not result in death, crimes that are committed where a firearm is present, and even shootings by law enforcement that also may or may not result in death. There are a variety of possibilities as to why these other categories are included in their data, but the reason that seems most logical to me is that the number of homicides by firearm alone, it's not enough to warrant any major cause for alarm. And this becomes problematic when lobbying for gun control, because most, if not all of the laws, they're being written specifically to address people's fear of being murdered with firearms. These egregiously inflated numbers help to cause a sense of heightened urgency, alarm, or criticality around the legislation where none truthfully exists. We're going to spend some time now talking about these numbers as a whole and as they stand individually. And then we're going to wrap it up with some questions about, you know, what the motives might actually be. So to start, let's take a look at the Brady campaign's claim that there are more than 100,000 victims of gun violence every year. They base their data on a 5-year average from data that they pulled from the CDC's WISQARS database. The data that I'm using in this presentation, it comes from a variety of sources. The data comes in part from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, as well as the CDC, Also, the research study that was published by the National Academies Press. This was the study that was requested by President Obama while he was in office. And it also includes data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports, which provide a lot more granular data when evaluating homicides by firearm. And all of the source material that we're going to talk about today is linked in the video description, and I absolutely encourage you to spend the time to check the sources, to rebuild this data on your own. My goal is to be entirely transparent with this data. I want to be honest and open with y'all. To begin, when holding up the study that was requested by President Obama to the Brady campaign's number of 100,000, we find that the study estimated anywhere between 60,000 to 2.5 million uses of firearms for the purpose of self-defense. To clarify those numbers a little bit, self-defense uses don't mean that people were killed or even, that there were shots fired. Many times the mere presence of a firearm will stop a threat dead in its tracks. These numbers also have a very wide range, if you noticed. 60,000 to 2.5 million, that's pretty big. And there are indeed some question marks, when it comes to the accuracy of the data. It is important to understand, however, that this type of data, it's not tracked or reported on by any federal agency, and it really would be nearly impossible to do so. Even at the lower averages found in the report, that being 60,000 to 120,000 uses annually, and those numbers are quite intriguing. So I'm sure some of you are already excited, but it should be known that I can actually easily blow the Brady campaign's number of 100,000 victims of gun violence nationally on an annual basis out of the water. This is done using a combination of the FBI's UCR and the CDC's WISQARS data, and my data ranges from 1995 up to 2017. When the FBI started reporting on the firearm data, that's as far back as I went, what was publicly available anyhow. So if I tally up the aggravated assaults and robberies with firearms, suicides by firearm, and homicides, I can get that 100,000 number to go all the way up to an average of 326,736 gun violence incidents annually, without any effort, really. And that number sounds extremely scary. But we need to take a closer look at each of these data sets and also, see how Washington State stacks up to each of them. We're going to run through most of the data pretty quickly and focus primarily on the homicide data. And after we break it down, we'll look more closely at the gun control policies that are proposed and see an example of why gun control doesn't work, and why, after evaluating all of this data, I believe gun control is not about public safety. Starting with the largest of these numbers first, the aggravated assaults, we see that the FBI reports show that the national average for aggravated assault where a firearm is present is 155,476 assaults annually, and that's from 1995 through 2017. This is an average rate of 63.3 in 100,000 people in the United States. Washington State itself has an average of 2,001 of these assaults annually, which, when compared to the national average, is almost half that rate at 34.2 in 100,000 people. The next largest of these numbers are robberies committed where a firearm is just present. The FBI reports, they show that the national average for a robbery where a firearm is present to be 143,384 annually. This is an average rate of 59 in 100,000 people in the United States. Washington State has an average of 1,444 of these robberies annually, which, when compared to the national average, is less than half the rate, again, at 24.9 in 100,000 people. Now, if we move on and look at the suicide numbers, this came from the CDC's WISQARS database. Nationally, we see an average of 18,276 firearm suicides by firearm annually. This is a rate of 6.7 in 100,000 people that are actually committing suicide by firearm annually. Washington State, by comparison, has an average of 419.3 suicides by firearm annually, or a rate of 7.4 in 100,000 people that are committing suicide by firearms. This is a slightly higher rate than the national average. This actually didn't come as much of a surprise to me. Washington State's been long known for its high suicide rate. So finally, if we look at the homicide numbers, the event that is touted as the primary reason to enact more and more gun control laws, these numbers also just so happen to be the lowest of the bunch. And they're also the numbers that we're going to scrutinize the most, because these are the numbers that actually matter when making policy decisions, and they're often overlooked, ignored, or buried. The national average for homicide by firearm is 9,600. This is a rate of 3.26 in 100,000 people in the United States that are being murdered by a firearm. Let me remind you, our population in the United States is 325 million. Washington's average homicide rate by firearm is 108.1 annually, or a rate of 1.72 in 100,000 people. That's by comparison. So this is where my blood really starts to boil. We have organizations and policymakers making an extremely overt attack on the Second Amendment over these numbers. We're going to get even more granular now and talk about assault weapons and Washington State's newly defined semi-automatic assault rifles. So first, if you weren't aware, the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, they petitioned for Initiative 1639, and they took the definition of a semi-automatic rifle and changed it to semi-automatic assault rifle. This means that any rifle that uses technology that was first invented in the 19th century is now labeled as an assault rifle. This will undoubtedly be used for further political agendas to seek an all-out ban on semi-automatic rifles. This, of course, was only one of many nasty tricks they pulled in Initiative 1639, and I and others have made more videos that explain these in greater detail. And the Alliance for Gun Responsibility has even greater plans for destroying the Second Amendment in 2019. Enough about that for now, though. Let's take a look at how often these assault rifles are actually used in homicide. Nationally, of the 9,600 murders by firearm, a mere 408 of them are conducted with a rifle of any kind. That's bolt action, lever action, break action, black powder, or semi-automatic assault rifles, or so-called assault weapon. This is a rate of 0.14 in 100,000 people that are being murdered by a rifle annually. Here in Washington State, we see that of the 108.1 annual homicides by firearm, a mere 6.9 of those are carried out with a rifle. This is a rate of 0.11 in 100,000 people. To be absolutely clear, I am not making these numbers up. This is coming straight from the data that the FBI has been providing to us for the last 22 years. To put these numbers into perspective, I'm going to compare them to something else that is man-made, has risk that is equally out of our individual control, and that could happen to any person on any given day of the week, and is far more lethal. Automobiles. The average number of fatalities occurring as a result of a motor vehicle nationally are 38,960 deaths by motor vehicle annually for that same 22-year time period. That is more than 4 times the number of people being murdered with firearms, and more than 95 times than the number of people being murdered with a rifle nationally. This is a rate of 13.25 in 100,000 people, compared to the 3.26 by firearm or 0.14 by rifle. Even if we combine both homicides and suicides by firearm, we are still 11,084 people shy of hitting the national motor vehicle fatality rates. It's insane. Here in Washington, we see an average of 574.4 fatalities involving a motor vehicle annually, compared to the 108.1 homicides by firearm. That's a rate of 9.19 in 100,000 people, compared to the 1.72 by firearm or 0.11 by rifle. If any of these numbers seem insane to you, it's because they are. The only conclusion that I can draw is that the firearms policies that are being continually introduced are absolutely not about public safety. They are simply about control. State and federal control over you and over me. Initiative 1639, it was primarily funded by billionaires, not the people. This makes you wonder, or it makes me wonder, who stands to win here? Is it the people, or is it the billionaires? Well, I mean, gun control, it's a means to an end. That end is putting you and I further under the thumb of the rich, the powerful, and the greedy. These benevolent saviors who propose and pass this legislation will instead enslave us and leave us without a means for defense. We have seen this play out time and time again in very recent history, in our lifetimes, in my lifetime, in our parents', our grandparents' lifetimes, whether it was in Nazi Germany 80 years ago or in Venezuela 6 years ago. We are on a very slippery slope here. The slope that we are currently on right now is exactly why the Second Amendment was created, to prevent tyrants from coming to power, to protect us from the wolves in sheep's clothing. The Second Amendment, it has nothing to do with hunting, and it has nothing to do with self-defense on a personal level. Those two things are simply byproducts of its intended purpose. To be clear, absolutely crystal clear, I am not, repeat, not even remotely suggesting that this is a call to arms. What I'm saying is that if we give away our rights for this illusion of safety, we will suffer greatly in the long run. And it's just that, an illusion. Not only is safety an illusion, the threat to our lives and our safety by private citizens owning firearms, it's quite plainly manufactured. To the argument that the government has, tanks and missiles and drones and, would simply wipe people out if they fought back against tyranny, well, I disagree. They would have a public relations nightmare on their hands that would only just fuel support for the rebel cause. We saw evidence of this in 2014 with the standoff at Clive and Bundy's ranch. Regardless of how any of us feel about Bundy or what he was doing, he and most of the militiamen that were there were cleared of all federal charges. To further this point, we see what our own government does when it wants something done overseas. It arms and trains small groups of rebels to overthrow governments. Sometimes so well that they turn into terrorists and carry on with an international jihad that kills, thousands of our own citizens on our own soil, but I digress. As we saw earlier, Washington sits at nearly half the national average for homicide by firearm and has historically been very welcoming to private firearm ownership. If we take a minute to look at a state that has some of the strictest gun control laws in the nation, we should expect to see that the rates would make our rates look outrageous, super high, right? No, that would be wrong. If we take a look at our neighbors to the south, California actually sits above the national average for homicide by firearm at a rate of 4.40 in 100,000 compared to the national rate of 3.26. Even their rifle rate, while low, still surpasses the national average at 0.18 in 100,000 compared to the national average of 0.14. So it begs the question, if gun control actually worked, why are their rates so high? Well, there's a simple answer to this. Criminals, by their very definition, do not obey the law. There's truly nothing more to say than that. It is a very simple and absolute fact. I touched briefly on the Second Amendment's intended purpose. I know that there are people scoffing at this. Doesn't change the fact that it was what was intended. So let's take a minute, refresh everybody's memories, and read it together. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Our very own state's constitution has an even more expansive definition of the right to bear arms, and that's defined in Article 1, Section 24. And it states that the right of the individual citizen to bear arms in defense of himself or the state shall not be impaired, but nothing in this section shall be construed as authorizing individuals or corporations to organize, maintain, or employ an armed body of men. If this, isn't enough for you, and perhaps you're getting hung up on that word militia, a lot of people do, I encourage you to take a journey through Title 38 of the Revised Code of Washington, which defines our state's militia. And I've got news for you. If you are over the age of 18 and are able-bodied, yes you, are part of the militia. Right here, right now, today, you are part of the militia. As citizens, we are the unorganized militia, but nevertheless, the militia. It would behoove all of us to take action with our votes, with our voices, and our wallets, to be good scouts and be prepared. Because weapons like this, in the hands of private citizens, is a negligible threat to you or I, but is a great threat to those in power.